All right, everyone good? Okay. The advantage is policing movements are working at the local level for justice reinvestment. That means defunding police and reallocating resources to community services. Little Hernandez 20 defunding police part of history. Run justice reinvestment. We want to shrink the budget for police and further fund their school housing, employment, mental health services, law enforcement taking a large share of local budget. The criminal justice system is completely localized to a large degree. Mass mobilization across country now has the power to enforce change at the local level. The moment for communities to control their public safety regimes. And some local defunding is inevitable as protest movements win, but unless those reforms deepen, current defunding will cause shifts of predatory policing. Crockett in Earl in 20. Minneapolis is taking 17 police. Los Angeles Georgia funding budget. New York officials agree to shift 1 billion access now. Look at all sources of police funding and which ones are most predatory by PC. One single point that can turn upside down paths single focus slashing local police share by increasing reliance on predatory ways to make their budget shortfalls. Most important is to turn revenue by just by policing try by stops and other routine action predatory taxes generate revenue, so lots of support for law enforcement to seize cash and property, seize local revenue derived from predatory policing taxes, police cutting police to share, squeeze revenue, bullying, modest cutting, and encourage reforms to generate their own revenue, increasing face-based contest communities that already over police defunding, police should involve abolishing civil asset forfeiture, defunding police is necessary to transform over police society. Activists will need to address all the revenues because it's part of a broader defunding plan, and without police defunding, localities will face widespread community disinvestment to maintain police budgets. Covert in 20. Out of the movement has come a surge of organizing push. City councils are running liable to police budget need to starve social services back to seeing successes. It's unprecedented. State local budget being despite the drop in tax revenue to be forced to make deep cuts, keeping funding local police intact, or increasing rural reductions elsewhere. The crisis has increased the need for the fire free services on the shopping block. Federal funding is key for warrants one and undermines local budgetary accountability. Distortion of incentives means the current protest will result in mass increases in police funding. Harmon and Weaver 20, the federal government contributes billions to local law enforcement programs, subsidize and incentivize the injuries of harmful police surveillance. Military the government strong incentives for community to engage in intrusive policing. Local civilian pro local process has signed up on policing. The agency wants a funded to sign up on the local budget process. These programs empower to making those worth local dollars with bypass ways of holding police accountable. Principle that police getting these outside dollars for intrusive policing. People continue to protest against police brutality. There is one parallel protest in the 96 years sparked because police brutality. Many aftermath and expanded police power double at fast forward agencies uprising from Rodney King expanded funding fast forward to Ferguson. Many cities expanded funding, and two, it allows local police to become self-sustaining and achieve budgetary independence from local governments. Harmon 15. The funds come local government. The president provide a crucial form of political control over departments. One, which federal programs disrupt them, and federal government programs provide funding and equipment power to give local parts. That means to secure resources without this local check. These programs the agency creates equipment and has for local governments in their budget process possibly approval. Local officials are not involved in public authority laws to give local parents resources directly. So for critical meeting input, local police activities 80% personnel cost per program fed salary for officers. As a result, is to free officers engagement to transfer activities in local budgetary contracts to reduce local police and defense and local funding for their personnel and personnel costs, weapons and equipment to increase supplies. The 1030 difference in transfer of vehicles, running surveillance and communication equipment directly to police departments. The federal sharing program is designed to subsidize use of force and covert policing precisely local governments and support the federal programs to leave operational costs to local resources as a corporate funds to use for these costs. The task forces are effectively self-sustaining. 3, sending political civil net orient all policing towards coercion and enslaved local politics or movement pressure. Harmon 15. Federal programs incentivize more harmful policing techniques and 12 billions each year across federal agencies. 90 years greater federal public safety programs are contrasted federal civil rights programs on policing. The JAG brands of 1030 Homeland Security communicate federal message about policing that papers coercion public safety vehicles and monitor should be responsibility to harm police do. Federal programs undermine these preconditions. The use of force, invasions of privacy, arrests, and stop their child in public and in public officials for about pushing for change. Local citizens or use political process and change police or city police doing officer training police policies oversight and reduce practices that impose harm. Local governments are responsible for about police coercion with individual innocents or widespread practices lead to strong public backlash. These concerns can't afford direct control over police practices. 4, massively expands police violence to crush protests. Shank in 20. Billions worth of military equipment has been transferred to civilian departments. It's led to militarization policing. Commonplace the amendments as the ambush protect vehicle respond to protests. There is a relationship between the transfer of fatalities and officer bomb shootings. More militarized law enforcement agents become more likely. Officers use legal violence and civilian deaths have become to increase by 130% when police acquire more military equipment and more protests set up. Convenient law and order pretext of occupation. American streets police protest has to be understood. The result of law enforcement agency preparation actively enforce and public safety redefines wars on the public government gets up and stop militarization at its worst by thunder calling funding and national police forces to the work and disarming law enforcement will have to take place at the local level. The impact of systemic racial subjugation and mass incarceration. Only defunding can respond to crazy policing tactics in black communities. Hansford 16. Mass incarceration and conflict embracing due to pervasive policing plots for racial targeting community policing essential support for community policing. Mass incarceration, anti-black state violence, racial targeting, jailing, killing attempts to force black people into submission through the use of violence. They power must end orders and force with violence and policing population be interrogated, search and interrogating community policing interrogates hotspot policing for targeting low income areas where people cover signs zero tolerance which result in criminalization, minor violation, torture, surveys becoming excuse to warrantless searches, child registration programs becoming tools to intimidation, meeting with taking make religious legislators becoming communities opportunities to gain community buy-in to conservative ideals, community members also law enforcement heavily state public community assets, resources that would otherwise be useful for resistance, penetration, community life is more effective means system and control for the state. Thus, the plan the United States government should enact substantial divestment of policing in the United States contention to a solvency. Federal divestment is policing as a catalyst for larger movement demands and reallocating resources into disenfranchised communities. Bennett in 20 recognition of the devastation of overplacing overpopulation warrants real meaningful change. That it looks like an end to 1033, an end to cops grants that put police in schools prohibiting drug laws being used to continue low-level arrests and the drug or destruction of black and brown communities. Federal government must get out of the business funding arrest incarceration. The plan is an imagination of how to realize the vision for Black lives. While it uses the law, it rejects the law as is strategically deploying reform in this context, breathes life into the abolitionist framework. Act Bar in 18. The most imaginative voice when they write just moving and fighting for more before the city hard to black and marginalized communities seeking the basic governance powers for policing surveillance, mass incarceration, moving down to policy proposals, and engage in law reform campaigns and simultaneously promoting injustice law politics. It would be wrong to think the movement has given up on law. The movement not to operate as a level rather dreaming your imagines possibilities in the broader country. Imagine the state, the laws fundamental what movement actors are fighting against, and for visions reimagined policing, boarding, and decarceral gender, reading, abolition, imagination, free policing, surveillance, incarceration, shifting resources, movement, offer transformative affirmation, vision for change. Racial justice movements are working to build another state, another world. They are using image use laws, a tool to build the alternative futures, the primary commitment to the law to do that to its legitimacy to the people, the motivation of protested during set of social structure vision seeks structural reform that moves beyond constitutional rights. The vision forces reducing its large social and physical footprint and shifting resources. Elsewhere, the vision is the frame beyond the police violence and criminal justice and interlocking set of historical systems that propel and draw from anti-racism. The political vision much uses the ethical and the defiance critique. The movement has not rejected reform. The approach to reform is rooted in decarceral agenda and rooted in abolitionist imagination. Prosecutors and police are only the starting point. Divestment is a vehicle for the abolitionist ethic. Reform is necessary to address the material harms of white supremacy while catalyzing other radical demands. The plan is not the final endpoint, but rather a critical first step towards larger transformation. Act Bar 18, the state must be transformed, the law must be transformed, the police must be eliminated at least of their social fiscal footprint, or police must be diminished if not eliminated. Law reform to address the material harms of specificity, and patriarchy undermines these structures. A core part must be to shift resources from criminalization into programs including housing, healthcare, education, jobs, vision, culture, divestment, federal policing programs, military government for local policing. It's not conceptualized abolition as immediate. We need steps between where we are and abolitionist future, focusing on incarceration and strategy of reforming sense of the way to abolition of vision, culture, divestment from prisons, police surveillance, and policing resource be reinvested to restorative services, not conservation, but not gets wrong without the shrinkage of policing and defunding is a key first step to larger social transformation. Policing is a society-shaping institution that upholds every aspect of the current social order on what's so in 20. You abolish the police with defunding, undermining the police to preserve either through revenue or political power as a key first step of defunding is ongoing battle with abolition as the goal under defunding program with abolition is all that and we can pursue alternative models of justice that view crime as a harm to people, relation to community and worker process to repair the harbor, transform the causes of what our country looks like in the coming years will depend upon what we do with the police, and abolition requires tactical alliances with the state, otherwise the state crushes abolition by itself. Institutional capture is necessary. The plan co-ops the state, not the other way around. Gibble Muhammad and 19, abolition not only understood the media, triggering all prisons for a gradual project of decarceration with radically different legal, institutional, regulatory forms. So plan criminal law enforcement. When slavery was abolished, black people were set free, but they lacked access to material resources that would enable them to live free lives. Prisons but thrive because the absence of those resources, they cannot be eliminated unless new institutions and resources are made available over different controls and means to empower community center abolition institutions. Alliance of state actors we necessary to advance alternatives to policing. Strategic partnerships with governments must be calibrated with an eye always on the abolitionist rights.
All right, awesome. Just give me a sec to pull up my timer.
One sec.
All right, you good? All right, the first question I want to ask is of the 1AC Bennett evidence. In the ununderlined portion, it says that there will still be limited instances where law enforcement and communities have encounters. What are those instances?
What are those instances? I mean, I think it's just talking about in the broader context how divestment and like decarceration are sort of like these gradual processes. So it's not like, you know, we pass the plan and woof, all cops and police, you know, kind of go away, but it rather says that we sort of, you know, create a vehicle to expedite divestment. So that way, you know, those encounters are decreased. Sorry.
I guess, why is it gradual? Why does it have to be gradual? Yeah.
Well, it's not that like the plan, I mean, we fiat it like immediately, I guess, but it's more so that like no one can obviously like fiat abolition overnight because, you know, that's just unfortunately not how the world works. So divestment.
I mean, we're not talking about abolition though. We're talking about divestment. Why does the divestment of money have to be gradual? Why can you not just immediately like remove funds, remove all support for these organizations?
Sorry, maybe I misunderstood. We think divestment like is immediate. It's not that like, you know, we roll out the plan in like phases.
Gotcha.
It's more that like, you know, the process of divestment and like everything else that comes after it is gradual. Sorry.
Gotcha. Okay. The comes after it part, the Bennett evidence goes on to explain, you know, we know dollars need to be better spent and they need to be spent on Black and brown communities. Who decides how that money is spent and who gets access to those resources?
Local governments with community input.
what does community input look like?
Community input means that they have sort of like control, and they have the ability to sort of, you know, give like their opinions. They have the ability to sort of, you know, pressure like local politicians, right? Their city councils, etc.
Control and opinion are very different. What does the control aspect look like?
Well, I think those things kind of like go together, because we've read a lot of other pieces of evidence, not just Bennett, that sort of indicate that local governments are more responsive to community concerns.
Okay, so but it's still the local government who kind of eventually decides how the resources are allocated.
Yeah.
Okay. The Crockett and Earl evidence, what is the difference between predatory policing and the status quo?
Predatory policing are just like sort of different, like more, I guess, insidious or intrusive tactics like of policing, right? So some of the examples that it kind of gives, let me try to scroll.
It lists things like civil asset forfeiture and kind of like, you know, invading people's places without warrants. Why does divestment prevent that? That seems to make it more likely that the police will be scrapping for resources.
Well, no, that's the whole point of like our uniqueness argument, which is that current protest movements are sort of winning. They're pushing for divestment, but if we don't deepen those reforms to call for like total divestment and not just like tiny like fixes to like how, you know, departments operate,
I have a question on that. The Akbar evidence seems to indicate that most movements are actually not focusing on like litigation and legal reform, but you seem to exceptionalize the legal cases. Why is that a good thing to do? Why do you make that choice?
I don't think we've exceptionalized them. I think we've talked about them sort of in concert and how they
realize the vision for Black lives.
Yeah, that's part of the vision. The plan is.
Alrighty.
One.
Yeah, take your time.
I like that Kevin from The Office is just chilling in the corner.
No, that's Dwight.
Dwight, sorry, I've watched The Office like once.
How dare you put Dwight under erasure like that? Okay, we are, I know. All right, we are good when y'all are.
Cool, it's 2 off and then the advantage. Oh, 1 second. Okay, everybody's good to go? Cool. First off, topicality reform means to make government more effective or equitable to meet existing goals. Patashnik 11, I define reform as non-incremental change in existing law and policy to make government more effective, literally for reforming an area where government has not been effective as and equitable. Police reform means increasing funding or accountability. It's distinct from defunding, dismantling, and abolition. Ben Kesslin, joint reform about funding for the police now, call for community police and police reform focuses on limiting officers' authority and holding police accountable. Activists demand that police be in a part of the decision to dismantle when cities decide they don't want to pay for their police. Then this abolition for to reimagine society funding means police means just reducing their budgets to a boss goes beyond slashing voting issue. Our interpretation creates a predictable topic mechanism. The alternative of allowing reform to be any improvement depends on subjective judgments on how to make something better and seals coordinate generics, creates a multi-directional topic that's limitless and has no common disad, critique, or counterpoint ground. That makes debate impossible. Next off, the critique. The app misses the forest for the trees. Policing is a function of policy and all its brutality that encounters social wealth and assigns it to individuality as a process of bodying criminality into a referent that can be captured. It's not a question of ending the police, but ending policy, which kills more black people than the police ever could. Moten and Hardy 20. We're not going to sit here and argue over defunding police. Once you defund, you need to take care of policy generally because policy kills more black folk. Police are just policy that is so brutal as most blatant. The black person has never not died of anti-black. Even though they kill every one of us, they can't kill us all. And that distinction is crucial. That is one of that's insurgency is not only pure and against the police, but ontologies before the benefits of the foundations of the police and the nature of the dishonors and the crusade to say black shuttle up and social assets such that such that theory can't be kept in protection for black left. The question becomes what we can do that is impossible to want something other than the question is not empty without an answer. In particular, their insistence on gotta use the federal government or else police will enact more violence on black folk as the subjugation of the world to the brotherhood of man, a fetishistic attachment to the state as the only site capable of breathing humanity back into the world through a lens of juridical rights, which assumes that legal status is synonymous with belonging and care rather than suffering and brutality. You should reject this ethical blackmail. Well, hell yeah. 14. Suffering as a hallmark of sentience and brutality. Hello, Sushi. The defining feature of those subjects excluded from the law, humanity due to the political violence, even as the rights of access to inclusion and equality. Human rights discourse, physical and psychic residue of police political violence enables victims to be recognized as belonging to the brotherhood of man who leads humanity's Western member demands comparing subjugation to adjudicated warrants for condition politicized identity and describing its pain and politics can hold out no future to the tribes. Under this pain, time solidifies what already sort of I want to offer say positive overcoming, not beholden to the wounded attachments and fixated fetishistically and decided to change the moving for rights equally as full so to make precondition to entry only indulging certain types of physical violence, overcoming the physical violence with love is economic realities remain outside of human rights is constructive of the foundation of desirably behind physical separation take on possession with granted their humanity, juridical humanity that bestows and resents humanity is individualized legal status the beta property maintains the world of man entry fee is white supremacy the benefits accrue to juridical knowledge and executive steep entry precedents inclusions hinted on accepting the codification of personhood as property justified with arms rights contract with the trespass subject of the Native Americans the tabula rasa of whiteness under the prerequisite for the law the court conceded personhood of indigenous subject if they chose to convert to whiteness to ensure America will become white by killing the indigenous state demand the denial of personhood does not stand in opposition to the genocidal which of whiteness represents different property the same way racialized and juridical assemblage to produce both black and native subjects as aberrations of manifest unquote human law establishes an international division of humanity fortifies the supremacy of man pronounced inherited the flesh even subsisting human death from the outwardly delectable defectable to the microscopic interior of the human can be embodied in any given an arbitrary mode by the property relations twin phantoms of racialization property relations unsettled premise of subatomic and cellular humanity is absolute biological substance policing reform obfuscates and legitimates police legitimizes police brutality by making it seem exceptional rather than the inevitable result of liberal politics. Linneman and Medley 18. Cursory review of the history of police hold the shortcomings of the reform administration techniques used by Clinton's police in 1930s and employed by U.S. personnel the CIA black sites flooding escapes was the centerpiece of one of the first efforts of the reform police violence. Chief Justice Hughes remarked that the kind of torture of the administrative police reads more like pages torn from some medieval account than a record made within modern civilization. Search remarks portray the problematic thing about police violence. The brutality of direct corporeal events is thought to be a vestige of the past, not something common to civil society. Violence of the most stomach-turning variety, such as police dogs let set loose smalls, always at the disposal of the police. Is in fact celebrated police who invoke the theology of the thin blue line to reform the notion that it is they who ensure civilization's survival. It is here the violence of liberalism and reform come to view the better how liberalism and the ability to threaten violence while denying it. It is an error of hope liberalism was ever expunged from police to get those who refuse to see the crimes as routine rather than even or acceptable reproduce view in perpetuity while codifying superficial hours law policy and procedure directed in context with the exceptional law. So work to secret violence under the cover of formality. This rhetorical move perpetuates the racial and white supremacist state violence productive of American globality. Rodriguez 7. The U.S. prison regime is programmatic condensation of white supremacist state violence prison is fundamental to methods of legitimate violence across the globe. The attempt to treat prisons itself commercial the central facet of how domination produced American globality refers to the production of U.S. state technologies of domination, genocidal violence, war making, racist violence, mass imprisonment, and the capacity to be mobilized all over the world, including by the states that are nominally autonomous to the U.S. The alternative is abolitionist pedagogy that builds critiques and movements against state violence by countering hegemonic rhetorical frame. Floyd 11. Invincibility of domestic state violence constrains the imagination and imperative of building futures internationally, domestically, institutions, reproduce relations of hierarchy, domination that contribute to family separation, fragmentation, labor exploitation, death by bullying and non-killing. Future means challenging prisons at the end of confronting hegemonic frames that understand state violence is exceptional rather than historical. Abolitionist pedagogy works against the assumption of necessity, integrity of prisons and state violence, dismantling prisons about dismantling relations of white supremacy, heteropatriarchy, and economic exploitation that undermine possibility for freedom and even flourishing. It has an expansive violence imperative that demands an interconnected practice of war, dispossession, and rural suppression of opposition for forging looks on different sectors of violence or organizing. We looked, for example, the civil revolution or non-aligned movement, which regarded any Cold War sketch for autonomy, building economies, institutions that foster creativity, care, self-determination, and responsibility are among abolition visions. Police abolition must be the starting point. Imagining a world without police and then enables us to shift the narrative and reconceptualize the institution. The aphylaxis out of those possibilities. Ciccarello, Marher 20. When policing is a way of life, it's hard to imagine alternatives. We don't know belief what a world without police would look like, but we know that police don't serve and protect the police were created to serve the interests of the white and healthy could do to do so. Police are future just for brutality, violence, and corruption. Reform won't cut a civilian oversight committees or toothless community policing weakens communities and call for body cameras overlook research showing that cameras do more to convict than hinder the police. Police cannot be reformed; they must be abolished. Abolishing the prison will be police will be a long and uphill battle, but advocates of it succeeded in shifting the narrative. But there's now agreement that the war and drugs, catastrophe, mass incarcerations, crisis, the little sort of this means beginning to imagine a world without police. The advantage: 1, focusing on police brutality reduces racism to a question of intentional acts of officers. It lets institutions responsible for systemic racism off the hook and distract the movement from broader change. Taylor 20. Beyond what brutality will discuss conditions and inequality, otherwise reduce racism. The outrageous intentional acts will downplay the cumulative impact of discrimination. The many spread efforts like systemic racism solutions in the system. The roots of oppression are left in place. We cannot allow momentum to be stalled by an discussion about reforming the police. We have to ask about residential segregation, job discrimination, schools. That's right. Provide deeper incentives that compel people to fight policing is the tip of the iceberg. We diminish the task by continuing to call upon the agency to fuel the crisis. Turn. 2. Turn reinvestment. A. Defunding can't solve without generating energy for reinvesting money in community needs. Vitality 20. Defunding means to reinvest in communities supported a lot to divert in that money in ways that actually directly replace the function. B. The app doesn't cause that. Any energy it generates is co-opted by bureaucratic interests. Wiki 20. Defund does leave up with the question of alternatives. No police at all is political, non-sort of political vacuum left by such a non-reformist reform will be filled by very reformist reforms. So defense cut budgets and reallocate. The cuts are limited, and after the marches peter out, easily reversed. In the wake of the recessions, SLGs are under pressure to cut across the board. Money freed up will vanish into the ether. 3. Turn private policing. Localities will just hire private security instead. Rushin and Michalski 20. Another impact of defunding is the shifting of the private security security forces and public safety when local governments are not adequately invested in arrest wealthy residents still have by investing in private security to lead to more residents and communities of color underserved private policing face of running exacerbates inequality based on socioeconomic status. So private officers are poorly trained and regulated. 4. Circumvention. Police unions water the plan down. Broadwater and Edmonton 625. The police Salvador make a direct appeal against consequential relief from stalemate as a result of lobbying by law enforcement, building relationships and policy advocacy, contributions and endorsements. Unions use their clout to resist new mandates. The Republicans have rejected measures and refused to embrace any changes until they received assurance from law enforcement that they would not oppose it. Both parties feel alienating and being soft. 5. Cutting militarization doesn't solve and causes the actual military to intervene in crises. Carrick 17. Policing is local where the needs of public safety exceeded the local jurisdiction. Federal assistance available. The federal government is not using the program to force law enforcement agencies to do equipment transfers are at the request of the local agency. Federal oversight problems are tangential to the local issue. Transparency and oversight belong to the local jurisdiction. Employing in the local jurisdiction should not be considered some spontaneous mutation, but a process has been allowed, encouraged, or ignored by governing bodies. And legal acting capabilities to replace localities in need of actual military assistance. 20 seconds left. If there's anything you want me to say, Caitlin.
Oh, good. You're speedy today.
Apparently. All right. I'm open for cross-ex.
Right, speedy. Okay. Status of the alt?
Unconditional. Like T's a procedural, but we're gonna go for the alt.
Yeah.
Sorry,
Okay.
Yeah, the alt and framework are indistinguishable for
is it
what it's worth.
Is it a floating pick?
No.
Okay. Does it fiat any particular action?
No, it's a pedagogical stance.
Okay, so it's only pedagogical, but I assume there are material aspects to it. Are there any state-based reforms possible or consistent with the alternative?
Our pedagogy doesn't advocate it, Caitlin.
We don't think civil society should exist. Like, our argument comes with the idea in which we understand what it means to like police that society and what it means to kind of accept individuals for care and whatnot.
So your evidence says that in order for abolition to be effective, we have to create different social programs, community institutions to like replace policing, right? So why don't things like, state provided healthcare, state housing programs qualify as the same kinds of policy and reform that you all are indicting?
Well, because you kind of got to get to the broader question of the origins and the foundations of those kind of institutions. State-provided healthcare, et cetera, still relies on forms of policing, even if it's not by the literal police, in terms of who is allowed access to these services.
Yeah. Sorry, but I mean, a lot of your cards in the underlying portions would say that those things are good. So I'm just wondering, like, how do you resolve some of the tension?
The Black Panther Party's community initiatives were good because they divested from the systems that like require kind of resource distribution based off of who the state finds exceptional or worthy of care.
What mechanism does the alt use to force a shift to different alternatives like to policing? Like, how do you put pressure on local governments and their budgets, et cetera?
Our argument is that pedagogy and scholarship that is explicitly centered around the world of abolition as its endpoint and explicitly sort of centers that as prefigures it, is itself a motivating factor that forces people, especially within debates, to reshape their perspectives and how they think about the world. And that kind of cognitive dissonance that it creates is the impetus for it. Yeah, sorry.
Why do city council members care about your pedagogy?
Well, I mean, I don't know if they're going to care or not, but we'd get rid of them if they don't.
Okay. When on the private policing turn on case, how does the alt resolve that?
The alt resolves that because it rejects all forms of policing, which means that communities wouldn't seek private security for security.
What's the mechanism for that?
Same one we outlined before. That starting here at a pedagogical level can force individual scale reorientations, and doing that consistently and iteratively is a good way of building up broader momentum.
I think a good example of this was I forget what state it was in. I didn't have my timer. Let's start. Okay.
Okay, sorry. Go ahead, Caitlin.
Oh, I was going to say is I think a good example of this was, I forget what state it was in, but I think it was in Minneapolis. There was a scandal related to sex trafficking ring of children, and community were able to track it down, and the police actively prevented the community from kind of track it down, burned all the evidence, like got rid of cop cars, whatever, which is kind of like our model for kind of approaching the nature of security and whatnot. It's community based and kind of recognizing the actual threats, which are kind of police in the state-based organizations.
Okay. I think Josh is just gonna send it, or
yeah, the TAC should be sent. Have it in your emails.
It's just the 3.0 one, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It'll be T, case, and the K. Are both of y'all good?
Yeah.
Email, are you good? Okay, cool. We meet divestment makes government more equitable and increases accountability. Their Castle card is from an NBC reporter with no intent to find counter-interpretation. Policing reform means focusing on the entire system of policing. Davidson 16 discussion of police reform seems to focus on individual officer behavior and ignores the operational steps that have an even greater impact on policing. If we have to achieve real reform, our focus must shift from the focus on police and policing to policy practices, culture of police organization. Prefer one interprets words for predictable limits. Their definition of qualitative, vague, and impossible to measure. Requires mixing burdens to determine whether the plan makes the government more effective. 2, defunding gives the neck better ground. There are more just as comparative case answer litany of picks like coordinates. The interim justify tiny often worse. Neck ground default to reasonability. Competing interpretation crowds out substance. Justifies excluding the best stuff on the topic for the sake of arbitrary limits. Case of review. Federal funding drives militarization of local police force. Federal money and equipment for help. Police circumvent local government control. Only defunded police returns power to community to step toward a politics of abolition. Line by line, 1 and C1 is in the context of reforms, not defunding. Little Hernandez 20 proves only defunding cause of reinvestment in schools, housing, mental health services, and employment. Some of the root cause of oppression. 1 and C2. A vital is resolved by the 1AC cover 20 abandoned 20 federal intervention. Eliminate city council oversight by divestment. Returns budgetary power to city council. B. So whiskey provides no empirical examples of which police budget cuts were reversed, and it doesn't assume a world of federal divestment. Last month, much more. City council cut 22 million. Portland cut 15. Redirected 5 million for the honorable wellness employees in Philadelphia. Cut 19 million, shifting 14 to affordable housing. Any risk budgets get restored after the march to stop his defense to the alternative. 1 and C3 is an odd flex. D. Funding local police is not better than the SWO, and if private police is inevitable, the alt alone fails. There's only a chance the app creates the momentum necessary to change social realities of violence. 1 and C4 is in the context of qualified immunity, not ending federal grant programs by partisan support and state legislators turned the tide against unions following George Floyd's murder. Campaign contribution are scrutinized. Republicans San Joaquin have proposed legislation banning union contribution to political campaigns, and Assembly Bill 392 is an attempt to partially end qualified immunity. 1 and C5 is a perverse defense of 1033 program that suggests, quote, there are good reasons for our civilian police to have access to such equipment in true emergencies. This ignores police misconduct and affirms that we should trust cops because, quote, the equipment is germane to the role of local law enforcement. This should discredit their unconditional commitment to abolitionist politics. Provides defense to the reps' arguments. The block will make fun of the card. Provides no Warner example of describing military intervention. Go to the K framework. The role of the judge is to weigh the fiat implementation of the plan against a competitive alternative. The next must generate unique links to the plain text, and the all should be evaluated based on the scope of sovereignty. We get to weigh the whole app regardless of prior questions. 1, fairness. Prior questions are infinitely regressive because the net can choose any arbitrary standard in the block that moves 1 to see offense setbacks, so when they aren't artificially inflates offense under the model. They can say debate is not a top chef competition, so we lose 2 advocacy skills. Weighing the debating the consequence of the plan necessary for detailed clash and topic education. The model skirts the question by shifting the focus of abstract prior questions that are opportunity costs to the plan. 3, movement building. All movements must compare strategies, create blueprints, and evaluate trade-offs. Our interpretation produces the best model to compare the test tactics for resistance. 4, fiat is good and we get is predictable based on the resolution. It generates consequential forecasting where we are forced to access to assess the broader consequences of the plan on a large scale. What's best for clash and argument or refinement, which is prerequisite to make the framework portable. Fair cloth and fair cloth 18 inadequate. Framework must include comparison, evaluation, of different argument deliberation. Can continue ethical can contribute to ethical critique by ensuring that arguments are considered and criticized, and people moderate partiality argumentation over what the policy should be adopted. Does not exclude other analysis such as representation, but subsumes that the framework prevents an effective way of evaluating discourse within an ethical produces impartiality. Does not filter a conclusion that would not pass questioning proposals are tested in light of the consequence. The framework can accommodate ethical issue when the broader consequential perspective. 5, look, the block is going to pivot toward an indictive human rights discourse and legalism focus, but you should not evaluate these reps' arguments. First, they will have 0 lens from the AF evidence. Second, their Lloyd card is just as bad. It explains that an abolitionist framework seeks to undo institutions that undermine one's access to humanity and freedom and unfreedom. Even if we perpetuate similar representation, the tension between their own Whaley and Lloyd evidence should serve as terminal defense against these arguments. The permutation debate, perm debate, perm double bind, either the all is strong enough to overcome barriers in the school and inclusion of the AF won't break their movement, or the all can't overcome the links in the status quo. Perm to the plan and all non-mutually exclusive parts of the alternative plan is an abolitionist demand. Davis is 20. The call to defund police is abolition demand. Defund the police simply withdrawing funding, shifting public funds, introducing mental health counselors to education, housing, recreation. Abolition is not primarily about dismantling, but re-envisioning the link debate. And Harney, 6 answers. A, the phrase once you defund the police, there would be need to take care of the policy concedes divestment as a precondition for larger political challenges. B, Moten and Harney are indicting rollbacks of previous reforms like those that followed the 1962 LA riots, police militarization after Rodney King, or Ferguson increased budget following the BLM's mobilization, but it's critical to note that rollback occurred because, one, abolitionist movements were incapable of sustaining oppression on local police, and two, the federal government was always the one that provided extra support. Meaning divestment is critical to today's protest. Lack of action is what ensures any gains won by abolitionists now erased, which means we have not lacked a uniqueness question on this debate. C, even if police are a symptom of policy, we should strive to confront both the sources of violence simultaneously, making the F mutually enabling, not mutually exclusive. D, Akbar 18 from the 1AC assumes Mona and Harney's larger orientation. The movement for Black Lives Landmark policy proposal division synthesized the ethical political commitments that demand structural change with practical legislation that dismantle anti-Black policies. Our second Akbar card recognizes that abolition is not immediate but incremental, beginning with a federal divestment. E, the alt doesn't solve the ontological claim that Moten and Harney borrow from Wilderson, since they don't end all of civil society. F, Wilderson's theory has practical constraints. Wilderson is 16. You can do your political organizing that will help us get relief from police brutality right now. We should be seen as people to educate ourselves and politically be against police, even while working to reform police practice. So the lack of strength should not contaminate our orientation. Let's use space for the educational project that is soundly anti-police, even if tactically we have to work for police reform. Second, what Haley, one answer, talk about power tag. No portion of the after relies on logic of police backlash against Black communities, nor do we deploy the rhetoric or logics of human rights anywhere stated on the framework debate. The Lemon and Medley, three responses. A, link turn the F shifts the political frames from an exceptionalization of police violence to a discourse that recognizes that police violence is constitutive of the worst aspects of American liberalism and social society. B, the card indicts the Chicago Police Department the cultural training programs, which we agree are bad. C, extend Shank 20 from the 1AC federal programs like 1033, fuel militarization, increasing police violence by 130%. Divestment eliminates the sources of the weapons and JAG money that allows police to settle court cases without holding police accountable. The Rodriguez evidence, two responses. To abolish prison, you must first remove the guards. B, reject rigid claims of mutual exclusivity. There isn't a fine line between abolition and reform. Davison Rodriguez, 2K. The question for advocates of prison abolition is how to balance reforms that are necessary and strategies to promote abolition of prison. I do not think there is a dividing line between the reform and abolition. It would be utterly absurd for a radical prison activist to refuse support for the demand better healthcare under the pretext reforms make the prison more viable institutions. The alternative one, the alternative can't solve the F. Investment into the 1033 program, federal war on drug grants, civil asset forfeiture, DHS terror funds, and cops. It has two implications. One, it ends local drug interdiction programs that fund 90% of local drug task force. It demilitarizes precincts like Ferguson, Baltimore, and St. Louis, which routinely crack down on protesters' status quo, and it ends cops, which literally gets cops fired since it supplies salaries for specialty task forces that otherwise would not exist. Second, it shreds local police budgets, making police completely dependent on local taxes. Such constraints ensure greater transparency and community control, but sparks a shift in resource allocation as proven by Baltimore, New York, and Philadelphia. Two, they're all makes it very clear that defunding has to be paired with reinvestment in social institutions that shift political power to communities of color. The plan's reinvestment in healthcare, education, and job creation creates the necessary conditions for abolitionist movements to flourish. This creates a double bind where either the alt completely rejects all state-based reforms and solutions, in which case we have a clear reinvestment dissent because they prevent state reinvestment in alternative social programs, or they allow the state to provide services in the world, or the alternative proving that the perm is able to solve this. The Kikero mayor confirms our argument. One, it says that abolition means pushing back against police privacy laws like HB 27, supporting calls for Mayor Jim Kenney to make contract negotiations for disciplinary arbitration, which affirms legal engagement. Two, it concedes abolition is not mutually exclusive with the creation of, quote, a space for the election of radical district attorneys. All this demonstrates that A, their authors understand the practical nature of reform as an intermediary step to complete abolition, and B, that institutional mechanisms provide the necessary safety valves that make abolitionist demands durable. If their argument in the 2NC or the 1NR defaults to that we have simply skipped other parts of the process that would be part of abolition, then they are just as guilty of this, given that they do not have any institutional mechanism to resolve any of the alt causes they read to us because they're just pedagogy.
Cool. Let me know when you're good for cross-ex.
Yeah, 1 second.
No worries.
Okay, I'm good.
All right, cool. First question. You say the AF causes reinvestment in schools, housing, mental health services, employment, et cetera. As per 1AC cross-ex, those are all led at the community level, as I understand it, correct?
Yes, those are led at the community level. The reason that they're not sustainable in the status quo is because federal programs come in and reinforce police budgets, which means city council has no power over those budgetary concerns.
Cool. So my next question then is, so are there like qualification processes for like who gets housing, who gets employment assistance, et cetera? And if so, do communities set those standards?
Yes, they exist in the status quo. Communities set them, but the key part of the AF that I think is really like unique for this argument is that when communities have more control over these police budgets, when we're able to sustain actual movements like Black Lives Matter, movement for Black Lives, then we say that they would have the possibility to change those types of standards as well if they're exclusionary in the status quo.
Gotcha. You said the AF causes cops to get fired by ending cops grants. Where do the officers who worked in those special task forces go?
We don't have like a piece of evidence that says like where they go afterwards. We just know that they don't have jobs as institutional cops.
Okay, gotcha.
Like, I'm sure there will be arguments about like why they're still bad anyway. But.
Yeah, you got us. You say that abolition must begin with federal divestment. The 1AC Akbar card is tagged as saying the plan is a critical first step. So have no steps towards abolition been taken yet?
No, that's not our argument. We recognize that there are other portions of the Akbar card that outline at least 5 other portions of what the vision calls for. And we acknowledge in our uniqueness claim that those things are happening and successful now. That's our argument about Portland, Baltimore, Philadelphia.
Can I ask a question about that? You've tagged it that you are the realization of that vision. Why is the legal institution necessary for that? Especially when the card explicitly makes it clear that that is the least important part according to the vision for Black lives.
If you like, one, we think that we've like highlighted all the things that like the vision is calling for, but if you like Google the vision for Black lives and like you look at like what they, you know, sort of defend and like what they're advocating, they explicitly say that like we need to use like policy. We demand the government like repair these harms. They are explicitly calling for divestment.
I'm gonna add a 5-second argument there as well. The argument is that these things are happening, but they are fraught because the federal government is able to bully their way into city council government.
Gotcha.
So it only becomes concretized when the federal government divests.
Cool. I don't have a ton of time left, so just a couple more questions. One, you say to abolish the prisons, you must abolish the guards. Do you think that the AF results in fewer people going to prison?
Yes.
Okay. Last question. You cite the example of Portland as an example of redirecting funding being successful. Federal government has started just like straight up like kidnapping, disappearing people in Portland because of the supposed chaos going on there. Can you explain why the reinvestment that occurred did not prevent that?
Well, the argument is that reinvestment can only occur if the federal government stops doing crackdowns like that.
You said reinvestment. Oh, fine. All right.
The reinvestment is local, like their budgetary constraints based on taxes.
Gotcha. Thank you.
The 2NC was sent out. Nothing's changed from it. I might add lib a line off of it from the flow, but like otherwise everything should be there. I tried to script myself as much as possible so I don't just rant. It's been too long.
And
the order will just be the K for those watching.
All you audience members out there.
Really feeling the crowd tonight, you know?
Not the same when we're not in the Ross Auditorium.
You know, Angel Hall Auditorium A where the walls are just sweating.
Shout out to Angel Auditorium.
Let me know when everyone is good to begin. I should probably turn off my cat's food alarm too, so it doesn't go off mid-speech. All right. Is everyone good to go? Okay, perfect. The 1AC has forwarded an incomplete theorization for how to combat police violence and leaves individuals unequipped and defenseless to deal with the very real consequences of shifting the institutional but not social nature of policing. We argue that policing is a form of anti-black relationality written into the fabric of the U.S. legal architecture, hieroglyphs of mastery that demands politicization to suffering, to paint those as resisting subjugation as the criminal underclass, attempting to prevent the legitimate or legally protected citizens from overcoming the epistemic and economic brutalities of life by calling attention to the decaying infrastructure of the state and its inability to be a site of change. Reject any and all attempts at ethical blackmail by the 1AC when they say the state is the only way to do X, because it's the same propaganda meant to distract us from dismantling the fabric of civil society. It leaves in place the justification and impulses towards anti-black terrorism and more converting insidious ways. Don't reward them for doing the bare minimum for the quote-unquote vision for Black lives, especially because their whole idea of being realization, it leaves in place multiple steps towards abolition and pedagogy, unrealized, the line-by-line framework, Weeby and New Lake. The K has always already been a rejection of the hypothetical consequences of the 1AC. We believe the ballot represents who has done the better debating. The 1AC argued they should win because a divestment is a good idea. We say that this still naturalizes and the culture of policing as being only violent when in particular institutional forms, rather than being reflective of the broader cultural war on blackness that exists in the U.S. since the colonists first rise on native soils in 1400. The idea that this is not a unique question of the 1AC is a move to innocence that pretends that as though the 1AC didn't take a stance towards abolish pedagogy without doing the hard work of being accountable for their choices, aka deciding to be a reform instead of all the kind of outlines for what it means to be abolitionist. The majority of this will be in the 1 and R, so I'm not going to go into the counter interpretation. The judge is a critical intellectual determining who does the better debating over the question of whether or not the criminal justice system should be reformed. Aids the point. It's key to critical thinking. It's the only way to ensure the 1AC is accountable for the ideological and theoretical underpinnings justifying the 1AC. Otherwise, it limits the app to a 10-second statement that allows any infinite number of heinous discursive choices to be made. Basic point is topic-specific education internally turns their offense. Only way to ensure a multitude of voices and opinions are heard on the criminal justice reform topic, limiting it to just the question of which policy is best practiced out the most important conversations, aka yes, no, abolition, yes, no, should the criminal justice system exist, etc. And internally turns all their advocacy skills arguments because it's most reflective of the best policy options and just discussions that are happening in the real world. When it solves fairness and clash better, it centers the debate around the question of reform. They chose to write a topical act, make them accountable for it. There is a cherry-picking dissent. Their claims of the movement building are laughable when they have chosen to exceptionalize the very small legal demands of certain abolitionist groups while not even being the type of divestments these organizations call for. We read Blue, that's Akbar, and 18, and they fear years after Ferguson there were shut down science and occupation stations, unions, and universities, the arrested curfews, tear gas, and riots. But the movements can't base it up and wagered on lawyers and via litigation. The movements have largely refrained from fighting or strengthening rights to demand legal recognition. The focus is not on vesting or even handedness to the law or police or restoring criminal justice or not increasing resources to community policing. The vision reveals the narrow parameters of legal debates meant not simply to address the hemorrhaging brought by police and the state lines, but to imagine a world blueprint for decarceral agenda. The movement makes 6 demands to end the war on black people reparations, divest economic justice, community control, and political power. The vision expands the framing of policing forward solutions different from those the DOJ reports. The end the war on black people is a concern with less particular mode of regulation, say police killing more with a larger set of practices, processes that dehumanize, surveil, control, press, cage, devalue, and black life divest. It reflects commitment, self-transformation, demanding investments in black people and divestments for criminalizing the caging and harming of black people. The vision is bear the state's current investments in criminalization as a choice. The demand is for immense sums of money to be spent on prisons, to police, surveillance, and corporations to be directed instead of towards reparations and reinvestments in restorative services. At the same time, the vision reinforces a broader frame, the interconnectedness of the state and marking the investment of black community state and private action are co-constitutive. One cannot be understood without the other. This view why institutions just targets without within the law reform conversations. The AF only sees this as being kind of local demands that kind of have to decide who gets the resources in the first place, which is still same barring of resources from black communities that does not understand that there is a fundamental anti-black form of racism in the distribution and the relationality of resources in the first place, which only the alternative can kind of deal with. The fiat argument, they get it. That doesn't mean the AF gets a perfect world order, which means they should be accountable for the limitations they come up against for choosing the legalistic path for being able to solve. There's also a white fantasy link here, the idea that you need to pretend there are constraints to the world for the AF to come to fruition, yet engage in endless hand-wringing about the feasibility and solvency of the alt is the exact fate of care that historically led to the most egregious compromises between abolitionists and anti-abolitionist forces. The prison loophole in the 13th Amendment, the Fugitive Slave Act, fits compromises, etc. All results in question of, but what if abolition isn't enough? Gotta do short-term reform, even if we don't change the structure, because that's the only justification that can be seen as politically salient. Don't let the AF guilt you into repeating that same behavior. It's emblematic of emotional policing, which proves that only focusing on the social context of policing is able to solve, and focusing on institutions only exceptionalizes the worst form of cases to cause apathy and inaction in the worst form of cases. And what tension exists between the Haley evidence and the Lloyd evidence? We have made the argument that only abolition and deconstruction of the concepts of policing, safety, punishment can create the move away for liberal humanism and its recognition of juridical humanity as a corrective to the gratuitous nature of anti-black violence, which means we're the only ones who solve the ontologization of anti-blackness in the United States or in the world. The permutation debate, I'll start with the link debate here. All the arguments in 1R also apply. First is the policy link. It's not a sequencing claim for the AF. The hyper focus on the legal interventions of divestment from the police becomes a bright line for recognizing Black Lives Matter that saps energy to challenge the violence and activate state. The AF's idea that the idea that the AF's move is the critical juncture shows white apathy and dismissal of black folk for being too greedy for asking for further challenges the prison industrial complex. Their argues that this is only done because abolitionists couldn't exert enough pressure is laughable. More is done in the past 3 months of unrest and moves towards abolition than in 6 years of legal maneuvering since Ferguson. That's the Modi and Harnam evidence. Second is juridical humanity link. The 1AC's politicization of black resistance identity for the basis of its action assumes the divestment for police alone can make the state care about black lives, which ignores the benefits accrued through lawyering that always hinge on the codification of personhood as property of the state. You are only protected insofar as the state deems your actions unreasonable and worthy of care. Only the alternative is rejection of appeals to legal personhood corruption, the perceived necessity of recognition of care. So with Haley evidence. Third is the individuation link. The 1AC's insists on the problem that the police is the federal 1033 program and police being required to respond to every issue rather than the concept of policing itself, which is amplified in the 1AC benefit evidence naturalizes state violence as a function of municipal police and not necessity of modern society that allows violence of social workers, realtors, property hoarders, etc. unnoticed while making complex defiance of canine units, mauling, shooting, tasing, etc., to bring order to individual instances of unrest rather than seeing the natural function control mechanism of U.S. imperialism and its global reach, aka we see the deployment of military units in the Middle East as inevitable signs of living in a war zone, but what happens in LA, Chicago, Dallas, etc. in response to rights. It's just an unbelievable. Police can never get that coordinated. That kind of unrecognition prevents actual abolition movements from ever taking flight. That's the Lindman, Medellin, Rodriguez evidence. They've conceded a uniqueness question as long as conditions of policing exist socially, remain the core functions of everyday life. Quotidian violence against black folk will continue unabated. Proves any inclusion of the app undermines the rigid opposition of policing as a way life focused on the institution group. The permutation do both. The permutation do both. There's a temporary activism decide modern progressive movements fail. It's Rodriguez and we have to clarify the premises of the mission that organizers undertaking the pragmatic focus building of ethical alternativism that constructs that model this is a variation of the good sense of the question whether the mission of people betray the response to the political requires a conceptual issue to the state that's far more complex and laborious than we allow in the Russian to build, organize, and write proposals step towards abolition practice. We require scholarly frameworks to understand the state that can be radically French on multiple fronts by abolitionist politics, and the establishment left remains unwilling and unable to address the question of social survival, mobilization, radical justice, and social transformation of the everyday terms. And when the state so openly, repeatedly declares the premises of coherence, the next argument, the permutation, not mutually exclusive parts. Either it's just permutation you do both, or it's intrinsic or separate. Since the voting issue makes it impossible to be negative because it makes the alpha moving target means that we can't get core negative ground. The alternative debate. The alternative is embracing abolition pedagogy that builds critiques and movements against state violence and call to end all prisons, capitals, and policing forces, both institutional and freeform, policing paradigms, military, industrial complex, non-profit industrial complex, etc. It's a recognition that the only way to confront the constraints put on life by the rigid nature of policing and social safety is to understand the conditions of our world as abnormal and not easily removed. It works against the assumptive necessity and integrity of punishment and caging as the only way to establish accountability and safety in our communities. This is what we mean by reinvestment in black and brown communities, able to solve the idea that the asked investments anywhere closest and combine us with broader abolition movements, because look at Butler, Portland, etc. Because there's still crackdowns by the FBI, CIA, because there's still a need for the safety of these communities. Think about it. They still leave prisons intact. They still leave in place things like ICE units, etc., which means that they cannot solve because all those people that they quote unquote fire just get rehired, and principal refusal to pander to the pragmatist impulse demands answers right now is the problem that's rooted in U.S. history. It's the reason why abolition movements have always been forced to compromise to quote unquote meet the materialistic demands instead of recognizing that abolition is here and now, and that reimagining can't happen. It's just a question of building on the pedagogy.
Just let me know when you're ready.
I'm good.
Okay, cool. I want to start with the White Futurity link. I guess, like, why is this not also just a link to the neg, considering it seems to make the argument that we have not accounted for all barriers that might exist in the status quo?
We have made the argument that policing is an integral function of civil society. We have given historical examples of kind of how that has shaped how all individuals within the United States have kind of developed their relationship to each other in different groups and kind of recognize that as a fundamental antagonism to the state. We don't think that we need to imagine away these constraints or that there's any perfect solution to them, but the hand-wringing that you pose that, you know, the alternative has to prove it solves, or, oh God, how do you respond to material concerns, is the kind of move towards compromise and questioning of abolitionist pedagogy that prevents the challenging of that antagonism, because it moves towards quick fix solutions which result in those political fallouts, like the loophole in the 13th Amendment, the 3/5 compromise, Fugitive Slave Act, etc.
So I guess my follow-up question to that is, in the 1NC cross-ex, we asked a question of, like, how do you also prevent, like, private people or people from hiring, like, private police? How do you, like, wish away city councilors? And the answer was just kind of like, well, if we don't like them, we'll get rid of them. I guess, why does this not commit the same, like, wishing away of constraints?
Because it's a recognition that there are ideological constraints in every society. Like, there has to be a social contract made in order for organizations of people to exist. So there's going to be inevitable constraints that certain people are not going to agree with it, which means that you're not going to be a part of the abolitionist society, right?
The cherry picking disad, which is reread like the Akbar 18 evidence, does the alternative fulfill the legal requests that are in the vision?
We think the legal requests are like the ideas of redistribution of resources, the reforming of social institutions, whatever. We think the abolitionist pedagogy can do that without requiring, you know, the Supreme Court or Congress or whatever, like, divest from the state or whatever. Like, resources can be taken back into community control, as proven by the last 3 months of protest resulting in way more breakdown of kind of control over resources than the last 6 years of lawyering and movement building have.
For sure. So
it's, I guess, my saying that you should not get the benefit, you should not be rewarded with the ballot just because you made a legal thing. Like,
for sure.
The abolitionist pedagogy requires always questioning and criticizing.
So the question is how, right? The part that you have reread also highlights things like the prevention efforts by, like, private companies how does your abolitionist pedagogy account for those types of resistances?
We argue that we should, do things like dismantle capitalism, dismantle the nonprofit
How?
industrial complex, the military industrial complex.
Yes. So these are like
one, withdrawing from
slogans.
those institutions. They require individuals to kind of work towards those institutions to invest their time, resources, whatever. Money is not the only way to do those things.
Sorry, I have one
Certainly,
last
yes,
question.
elites have control over those things, but they become less and less effective if the majority of the populace doesn't want them, et cetera, et cetera. Like, it's the same reason why, like, all pedagogical changes over time have resulted in revolutions. Sorry, didn't mean to keep cutting you off there.
No problem.
One R has been sent out, some slight wording changes and stuff, but all the argumentation's the same. The order is just the case debate. And I guess if I get to the bottom and I'm a lot faster than I thought I was, then I'll go and read that last card in the 2&C document.
The best one and move.
Just try my best. All right.
Really living out your Jake Buck Glodschlag.
It's my dream. Just want to be more like Glodschlag. All right. Are you all ready to go? Cool. Oh, wait, no, I'm not. Let me just get read mode up. All right, there we go. All right. The critique turns the F, and they can't solve it. Send 1 through 1, the reform turn. A common theme from the F is that there is 7 in the right direction. They return power to communities, free up resources, open up space for the movement for Black lives to influence community government. And we are impact turning that logic. They cannot win by being necessary but insufficient. Remember from the 2NC, policing is a lifestyle, not a law. If we win that thesis claim, it proves that they step in the wrong direction, that they're not abolitionist pedagogy because they generate complacency, which actively trades off with accountability and momentum for real change. That's Taylor. They can win if they change the minutia of police activities in the short term, but the cost is that policing will reinstate itself like a hydra in ways that are both more insidious and less recognizable because the app gives them an excuse to say that it's just better than before. They say it's about reforms, not defunding. This is the exact kind of semantic distinction that proves the link. The card they cite, when AC Hernandez says that defunding is necessary but not sufficient. They even highlighted the part where the card says that reinvestment is the goal of the movement. They have 0 cards saying that the plan causes movements to achieve that goal. Taylor subs, they cannot solve the root cause because they focus on the spectacular violence of police brutality over the mundane violence of systemic discrimination. So reinvestment would not happen because any momentum that they generate trades off with the momentum that they sap by stating the demand for short-term fixes, which means that local governments wouldn't listen to movements in the first place. 1 and C2, the movements turn, they don't cause reinvestments. That's Vital and Sawicki. Remember 2AC Crosslinks. They said that local governments control how resources are allocated and just assume that city councils will listen to activists about how to do so. This is aspirational and proves their focus on feeling better about police violence over creating lasting structural change. 2AC Davis from the K proves this argument. It says that defunding the police is not simply about withdrawing funding for law enforcement and doing nothing else. Before they can access a lick of offense, you should ask yourself what part of the 1AC mandates anything more. The first card they cite is 1AC Covert. It doesn't make a reverse causal claim. It says that without defunding, communities would be forced to cut social services budget, but it never says the communities would refuse that trade-off and be persuaded to cut police budgets instead of safety nets. It's more likely that local officials will just take the hit because they're rich and aren't affected by those cuts. Here's evidence on that question. Schrader 20 in Camden, disbanding the police was not accompanied by reinvestment. We can't separate the call. We can't make that demand alongside what comes next is just more austerity. The powerful might concede, send less money and then send money back to taxpayers rather than other services. Given COVID and shutdowns, there is a real threat. Their second answer is 1AC Bennett. This card is about as strong as my awareness of whether or not a Zoom call is recording before my lecture Q&As. It has 0 warrants. It just says that divestment includes ending federal programs like 1033 and COPS grants, but doesn't say that reinvestment naturally follows. The part they didn't highlight also recommend federal and state lawmakers explicitly funding community solutions, which proves there isn't precedent for it and that it can't say it's normal means. Their third argument is their list of examples. They're all irrelevant. For every Baltimore, there's a Louisville or a Birmingham. For every Portland, there's a Houston. For every Philly, there's a Phoenix or San Diego, all of which have increased their police budgets after protests. Demanding empirical examples of police budget cuts being reversed is bad faith because budgets barely ever get cut in the first place. Empirics go neg. Memphis and Chicago prove failing to redirect funding increases police violence. Wikelbaum and Lewis 20. Pets kept spending off precautionary tales by Memphis and Chicago found that cutting budgets did not reduce violence or produce relationships after a wait. The city's reduced spending by police plummeted, more crimes went unsolved, bribery trindled, and the cops that were left for reverse work overtime in Memphis. Complaints about use of force rose as overtime costs doubled. This does not take out the alt. Abolition is a process that doesn't end with budgets or policy goals. Policing is a habit that reinstitutes itself even when we think we've eradicated it. So the alt demands constant vigilance as a starting point. Budgets wouldn't get restored after the marches stopped post-alt because the marches would never stop. 1 and C3, private policing turn. They're actually net worse than the status quo. Rushin and Machowski say private officers are poorly trained and regulated with minimal licensing requirements and fewer hours of training required than it takes to watch just the first four seasons of Game of Thrones. Oakland and New Orleans both empirically invested in private security forces when police budget votes went down. This does not mean the alt fails. We never said private policing is inevitable, but it sure is telling that they thought we did. No form of policing is inevitable, but it'll reinstitute itself as the broader perspective the alt offers. Them making this argument proves the Lincoln means they cannot win the perm debate. All our arguments about why the plan causes a shift to alternatives that are worse than the status quo are not us saying that status quo policing is better, but rather that we're demanding a third option. Every time they attempt to spin that as a defense of the status quo demonstrates that policing is unconsciously embedded in the ideological justification of the act, even when they think that they can effectively disavow it. Now, 1 and C4 circumvents the act gets watered down at best and rolled back at worst. It's Broadwater. Keep in mind that every example they cite is all prospective legislation that's been proposed, but they don't even have a warrant letter on the card for why they will pass or be effective, especially given that they're all state or local level and they have no indication of civil bipartisan support at the federal level. The Republicans in San Joaquin that they cite are actually a single district attorney who wrote a letter to the California State Bar, not actual legislation, and Bill 392 makes exceptions based on officers' assumption that the suspect might cause harm. Our evidence says that lawmakers won't pass bills unless they get the go-ahead from police unions, and the 2AC did not make a durable fiat argument, so at best, the plan gets filled with conditions and exceptions that make funding inevitable, and at worst, it just gets rolled back. Now, 1 and C5 is we're not going to go for the militarization turn. Nice try applying it to the alt, but keep in mind, we did not highlight the normative claims that they quote precisely because we don't agree with the whole context of the card. Rather, we presented it as proof of how right-wing clowns will react to the app. If they win that the scholarship is bad, that is a negative argument because the link that proves that they capitulate to those threats and make it harder to counter those sentiments. Regardless, it doesn't disprove the alt. We think that the military should be abolished too. Go back to 1 and C4. The app just causes the police to shift to asset forfeitures and fine and recoup funding decreases. Economists 20. The federal provided some research about 86% of police funding goes to asset forfeiture laws allow police to confiscate and keep proceeds there instead of reverse drug scene forfeitures disproportionately affect people of color. Mark said disproportionately affects people of color. If y'all want, I can send out a version with just the cards I read.
All right. Good. All right. And we're back. The order will be case and the criticism. Second. All right. Read mode.
Question for you, those of you who wear glasses, do you all get the headphone like glass like pane right here on your temples?
I do, yes. That is definitely a thing.
I couldn't tell if it was just these headphones are too big for my head or whether it's just like a common thing, so that's good to know.
Yeah, you're not alone. Okay, let's see. Come on, document. All right, cool. Is everyone ready? Excellent. There's no link to this focus. Instead, we saw that multiple app cards indicate the plan is in line with broader change, but it's the first step to make transformation possible. Taylor votes app. Bottom of the card says we need to demilitarize as a prerequisite. We're the only ones with cards by local governments in the plan. Our cards say that removing federal funding is key because by local governments are responsive now. Our evidence makes a normal means a predictive claim about what happens when we see federal divestment, which is why all the women in our examples are not responsive. The Vitalik card is highlighted like a fortune cookie. Zwicky doesn't enter the plan substantial divestment, prefer multiple pieces of qualified evidence that prove the plan forces a shift to social programs and community-centered abolitionist institutions, but they all cannot because they have no mechanism to force local governments to divest. Their Weisbaum card concedes our uniqueness claim that budget cuts are restored now absent federal divestment. You can't play the example game and also claim that they don't impact the alternative. If marches never end, then why did Chicago rearm? Now the private policing is just after the all, not the plan divestment. Durable fiat means the local governments don't have the cash flow to hire a bunch of mall cops to fill in worst case scenario. A few rich white neighborhoods hire security dude and put up a gate or something. The plan and permutation generate momentum so communities have control of the budget and can push back against the private fill and durable fiat obviously solves circumvention. Their card just says cops get mad. It doesn't matter if they lobby. The plain fiat divestment, this explicit rollback argument is new, which is why we get to say durable fiat. This also applies to the alternative because they can't wish away police unions with their pedagogy. The F and civil asset forfeiture. Local police can only steal property under federal sharing legislation, ensuring no shift to predatory policing post-plan. Their carrot card makes an app argument. It says local governments request 1033 equipment because they know the federal government will pay for it. That's why the plan is key. It removes the believe the environmental financially coerce localities into accepting tanks in their backyard. And this card is a huge double turn with the K. Their card is defending 1033. Their author is an ex-NYPD commissioner, for God's sake. The one and ours attempt to justify this is bonkers. They are the ones who have read cards saying that 1033 is good. If they don't have to defend their scholarship and only get to defend the good parts of what they highlighted, then we also get to sever any of our underpinnings that the 2NC criticizes. Game over. No Tasty's backsies takes out framework. Ethics doesn't just apply to one flow. Go to the K. Framing issue. The block-based solution to pessimism, but cross-sex means they can't access that multi-net card. To the state-based programs are necessary to replace policing institutions. They can't have it both ways. They also don't have cards to justify these ontology claims, which also implicates the 2NC uniqueness argument framework. We weigh the fiat implementation of the plan versus the alt. We have to generate unique links to the plan, not just merely the rhetorical frame. We access the role of the judge, but they have to prove that the plan makes this flow worse and that the alt can solve their own offense. Even if you think the underpinnings matter, they don't arbitrarily come before the plan because it's simply regressive, artificially inflated offense under their model by mooting the 1AC. It's self-serving. They can't simultaneously say that we get fiat, but that we don't get to make consequences because that doesn't make sense. The at worst just way the avatar impacts and compare them to the rhetoric links. On the same level, you can compare impacts and the impacts of their links and who outweighs just on basic impact calculus, which resolves all their offense. This is justified by our Slayer cloud evidence and TUNEP benefits one movement building. Weighing the plan is key to compare divestment versus other strategies. Our ACWAR card says that we need steps between where we are and an abolitionist future. Only our model forces direct comparison, which allows experts to create better blueprints. There's no link to the cherry picking dissent. We've read tons of lines from ACWAR that explicitly say that we need to divest and reduce the fiscal footprint of police. Dude, Google the vision for Black lives and their demands. They explicitly say that policy is necessary to advocacy skills. Prioritizing critical intellectualism is bad because they cause the trade-off with taking action. Fixating on tiny rhetorical choices means that we will endlessly debate about the imperfect word choices or something rather than enacting a plan that benefits communities. In order for them to get some of these links about the effects of the plan, you first have to weigh the consequences, which proves that consequentialism is inevitable. White fantasy just have links to them because they don't have any mechanism to resolve policing other than but our pedagogy. They haven't explained the process and steps for how that pedagogy translates to prison abolition. That was cross-sex of the 2NC. Now on the links, there are two filters. They are all framed is like, but you don't solve enough. The plan doesn't make policing worse, which means it's try or die for divestment. Two, they aren't solved by the alt, which means they can't be considered offense against the app. They link equally to them. Perm do both overcomes all their links. The double line absolutely slaps here. And their movement is so powerful that it can avoid all of their case arguments, and the residual link to permutation won't derail those movements. They link equally to the moat policy link because all their alt cards say that passing certain policies is good. Josh, should that work with the 2AC? The way Haley link doesn't apply. We don't entrench legal personhood. This cards about human rights rhetoric in the courts. We turn the policing link both with app cards like Akbar, Hansford, on Wisso to the policing as a society-shaping institution. It's not exceptional. Their cards critiquing other reforms that try to make cops look like more accountable, which is the opposite of divestment. They don't access Rodriguez. The words rhetoric or discourse are not in this card. It's just an impact by the U.S. prison regime. The perm do both is consistent and preferable for three reasons. One, Angela Davis said so. We read straight from the source in the 2AC. Reject mutual exclusivity. Or Davis and Rodriguez cards says there isn't a clear line between abolition and reform because there are worthwhile reforms like the act. This card also answered their dissatisfaction because of perm because the plan doesn't make prisons more viable, which is the bright line. The third net benefits community buy-in. Hansford Harmon said that forwarding private divestment strategies necessary to increase community buy-in. Otherwise, pure abolition out of nowhere falls flat with local governments. Rodriguez 10 from the 2NC is a perm card. The app employs the multiplicity of tactics used to challenge state power by contributing legal force to grassroots organizing. At worst, ethical volunteerism applies to the alternative. Given their CX answer, which presumes we can just get rid of people that don't agree with us. The plan is a prerequisite to the in order for protests to be effective, we have to demilitarize so cops can't crush movements. Before we abolish prisons, we have to get rid of the guards. In order for new community institutions to develop, we have to address the cash flows of local government. The alt can't solve because the private policing trade turn all their cases are been certified equally to them.
Will prepare.
Yes. We'll just do it over G-Chat because I think it's the easiest. Welcome back, everyone. The order for the 2NR will be the critique and then case.
I have a somewhat silly question. For the K, are you starting on like the overview, similar to like the 2NC?
Yeah. The like link perm stuff will be shorter because most of it's on the case stuff, but I'll make that clear. All right, let me just pull documents up. Okay, everyone good to go?
All good when you are.
Okay, cool. The 1AC missed the boat and should be held accountable for their choices. The 1AC's claim to realize the abolitionist movement by simply divesting federal funds from local police, not prisons, not ICE, not the military, etc., is a gross whitewashing of demands of black radicals that should be rejected on face. Policing is a social phenomenon, first and foremost. The call to render certain bodies as threats and criminals to justify gratuitous violence to satisfy white anxieties. It's why the 1AC's call for divestment alone should be held to a high standard because the stakes are too high and too many compromises have already been made. The legal recognition of federal divestment at best causes police to ramp up things like asset forfeiture and shift to positions like ICE, FBI, etc., or at worst causes full-scale private militias to fill in because they have not addressed the question of what it means to engage in policing, why it exists in the first place. It's because there is a fear of blackness within the United States, and anti-black racism is fully realized through the foundation of legal recognition. The idea that there has to be legitimate citizens that have to be protected from the criminals is what justifies the violence in the first place. Only the alternative can grapple with this kind of authentic positioning of blackness in the United States and within civil society, because it recognizes that the institutions themselves can never save us or never save the situation from anti-black racism, but only can perpetuate further roads of it. Only the alternative is able to solve this and is kind of held accountable for their recognition that nothing will ever be enough until society has been completely reformed, which is why the 1AC's move and gesture towards abolition should be rejected on face. It should not be rewarded with the ballot as being a quote-unquote good idea. The line-by-line framework they've conceded framework is a new link. The idea that we have not criticized the hypothetical implementation of the 1AC or the fiat implications is completely bonkers, especially when their whole argument is that the 1AC should win because divestment is a good idea. We have argued that naturalizes and mystifies the culture of policing as being violent because it only focuses on the exceptional institutional form instead of arguing that that policing is a cultural war on blackness that has existed since the United States was ever first an idea created on soil in the 1400s. The idea that we are not a unique question of the 1AC ignores that the very question of better debating is who does the better debating over the question of yes, no, should the criminal justice system be reformed. You should hold them accountable for choosing to be topical because it's the only way that the negative gets any stable links in the topic. Now, counter-interpretation. The judge is a critical intellectual determining who does the better debating over the question of whether or not the criminal justice system should be reformed. It's better than their interpretation and promotes critical thinking because it holds the 1AC accountable for the theoretical underpinnings and justifications for the 1AC. Yes, those are the consequences of the 1AC. It's why you consider it to be good, which means you should be held accountable for how you come to your description of why you're a good in the world. Filtering that down to a 10-second statement makes it impossible to be negative and makes the app unaccountable for any heinous things that they say to justify the 1AC, such as reading people who are like, we should bomb China or whatever to justify a tariff act, etc. All of our arguments is that the only way to solve that is by holding the 1AC accountable for that. It's key to topic-specific education. It's the only way to have a multitude of voices on the criminal justice reform topic, which is key to get in the heart of it. Second is key to fairness in class to solve all their offense because it requires things to be accountable to the 1AC, etc. The white fantasy link does not apply to the alternative, but does apply to their understanding of movement building and their understanding of fiat. The idea that we have to have hand-wringing about abolition not being enough or not being able to solve ignores the kind of social question of the ways in which policing anti-blackness that operate in civil society. Only the alternative kind of calls that into question and doesn't try to whitewash or kind of wish it away, but the AFT attempts to do that in order to attempt to call for fiat by saying that the alternative is not enough because it doesn't have a quote-unquote pragmatic solution to the question of institutional governments. Our argument is that we should not rely on them. We should ignore them. We should form our own social institutions. That is just as pragmatic as the act. It's the same reason why there's been compromise between abolition and anti-abolitionist forces, because that is not seen as being credible or enough, which is what has justified things like the three-fifths compromise, etc., which is bad. The only two links I'm going to go for on the permutation are the individuation link and the juridical humanity link. The juridical humanity link first. The 1AC's politicization of black resistance and identity as a basis of action assumes divested for the police alone can make the state care about black individuals. The Haley evidence indicates that this imposes a form of juridical humanity where one has to understand their legal recognition before they can ever understand care in the first place. It's the reason why before we can reinvest in black communities, according to 1AC, we have to capitulate to local demands instead of just actually asking black and brown communities, what do you need? What resources should you have? Which is the question of abolition, which means that they can't do any moral grandstanding. You should reject it. Second is the individuation, like their focus on the militarization of local police instead of the kind of action of policing and imperialism in the United States exceptionalizes those cases as being bad and ignores things like, well, if there's just private militias in white neighborhoods, it results in things like killings like Trayvon Martin, etc., which means you should ignore the 1 hours kind of move to innocence on that. Now, going to the case debate answers the rest of the Perm W bind and the rest of their alternative arguments. The reinvestment link, our argument is that they don't cause reinvestment. All their cards is we have to call for joints for defunding, which calls for reinvesting, but that's the alternative. Only the app, nothing in the plan mandates that. In no card says this nor will mean rich local officials will just enact austerity measures by keeping police funding the same. That's a Schrader evidence. Camden proves their arguments about movements influencing local officials or wishful thinking. For all their examples about Baltimore, Portland, etc. There's examples like San Diego, Dallas, etc. that increase police funding, which only prove that abolitionist pedagogy is able to solve.
Are you going to pause the recording again? Sorry, trying to get everything in the proper place. Everyone else are good? Awesome. For those of you flowing, it will be case and then the K. There are 3 reasons that you should vote affirmative. First is case local police are empowered by federal programs that encourage militarization and intrusive policing practices throughout Black, brown, and red communities that plans federal divestment ends programs such as civil asset forfeiture, 1033, the war on drug grants, DHS funds, and cops. This is not only demilitarizes police, but ending the transfer of military equipment, but also reduces employment, eliminates task force, and eliminates predatory policing practices. Loss of funding re-empowers local city governments who would now have more discretion over tax allocations. Current pressure from abolitionist movements have proven to be effective in directing the actions of such city councils like Baltimore, Philadelphia, and Portland. These negatively constrain police and positively impact social services, education, housing, and job creation through reinvestments. By reinvesting in social programs, we shift the political and social power of communal institutions, ensuring that political reforms won by Black and brown abolitionists endure rather than roll back in the following months. Line by lines, you should prioritize the entirety of the case debate through the rhetoric double turn, which is shade dropped by the 2NR. You don't get to creatively highlight your cards and defend the best portions of it. At best, your tacit endorsement of a literal police chief demonstrates how your alternative lacks a compelling force that can successfully disarticulate from the hegemonic ideologies. At best, we've won the right to sever reps, which is incredibly important. A word where the 2NR is very framework heavy, but does not have any material implications to the link debate extended. The Schrader evidence is the only other argument on case, which is shadow extended at the end of the speech. Cops can't just pour money into private police, or city governments can't do this either. While Covert doesn't have a reverse causal claim, Bennett does, which is what the 1NR strategically misses. Shows that federal divestment forces local counties to abandon militarization. The impact is non-unique, a world where the 2NR can't explain their third option to policing, which never materialized after the 1NR. The K is the second reason is the overview and framework. The 2NR's overview is overview heavy and fails to apply most of the arcs to the 1ER. The overview, we agree that police are policy. Divestment kickstarts social transformation, eliminates the incentives for federal use of ICE, which they've read zero evidence on. Their description of sociality is a bigger problem for the alternative than it is for the app. If anti-blackness is constitutive of all relations, how do you simply change the mindsets of all those that get your way now? This begs the question of the 1C cross-ex, where DML says we just get rid of the people that we don't like. And also their endless questioning of why police exist now is founded the material structures that ensure their replication rather than circulate truth claims about the horror of civil society. We should unravel those intermingled aspects of interrelationality. This is even worse than what they didn't extend the Moten card, which contains their only ontology claim for the alternative to resolve. Framework should be easy for you to resolve. We avoid that with the implementation of the plan against the alternative. They can read links about discourse and underpinnings, but those don't arbitrarily come before the plan. They haven't justified that. The role of the judge isn't mutually exclusive voting for the plan. We've justified reform, which should be sufficient given that they've dropped the case debate sufficiently. The 2NC should set hypothetical consequences as a new link, but then later said that both can't be true, which means you should default to our interpretation. At worst, just weigh the app and our impacts and compare them to their rhetoric links on the same level. You can compare our impacts to the links and decide who outweighs the basic impact calculus, which resolves their offensive critical thinking and apps depending on heinous things, which is the 2AC Faircloth evidence. The most devastating implication here is that they have said that we must be responsible for all of our scholarship and underpinnings, so I also engage in the same violent underpinnings on cases. It's simple. They read cards from ex-cops saying that cops should get access to tanks and grenades and minorities, and we should trust them. There is no way to reconcile this despite their creative spin. This means they can't access any of the framework arguments. They can't access any of the arguments about ethics, and it means that the perm is a no-brainer. If they could justify severing their awful reps, then we get to sever any out of our bad underpinnings. The 2NR conceded the 1AR argument, which I did above. The white futurity just had links to them more. They have whitewashed their social movement by claiming they can simply purge the movement of dissidents. If sociality is anchored by things like the 13th Amendment, anti-black policies, and the fact that white people constitute an antagonism to blackness, then they should continue to serve as barriers in the world of the alternative. But the 2NR's lack of explanation is how they overcome that in a material form means that they are not able to resolve those things. It should be laid as offense against us. The third reason you better permit is a permutation. Getting here with 45 seconds is just not enough. The fundamental flaw with the block and the 2NR is a failure to answer how they materially achieve the pedagogical horizon that they've outlined. We've simply outclassed them on the example debate. Davis 20 isolates that divestment exists within a broader pedagogy of abolition as long as it accompanies reinvestment. The case debate, in conjunction with the 1AC Bennett 20 and Cover 20, demonstrates that our achieved success in this transition. We've consistently forward examples of positive interaction between abolitionist movements and state legislators that they simply ignore in the 2NR. The cherry picking does that isn't extended, but our continued orientation towards the movement for Black lives and the policy proposal with the vision demonstrates the commitment to defunding the police as a first step toward the abolitionist horizon. They've conceded all of the examples about Baltimore, Portland, Philadelphia, and they don't even extend their example about Chicago, which shows that their marches don't exist or are not durable in the status quo, so it has to be paired with some type of institutional mechanism. Most importantly, however, they have no positive examples of movements that have been able to achieve the same scope and durability of reform absent interaction with legal institutions. They create a double bind for the alternative for our Davis and Rodriguez evidence, which is just better on the internal warrants than the one they read, the one they are, which the alternative either concedes the utility of legal institutions or they abandon those communities to the state anyway. Link debate, I only need to win a little bit of defense here to resolve it. They don't extend the moat and harness the Haley evidence. The absence to defend any rhetoric of humanism. They've read 0 lines from 1AC evidence, partisan context, a Dred Scott case, and international liberalism, which they've not applied to the AF. The Linneman card also does not link. It's contingent on you winning the case debate, which you just don't do because you get to it too late, and there's no explication of why our cards are not reverse causal.
Yay, debate.
Good debate, everybody.
Yay, debate.
Thank you, everybody, for watching this debate. The documents from the debate will be available via Canvas or will be made available to you somehow. We'd encourage you to not just, copy paste the stuff that we read verbatim. We're providing it for the interest of accessibility and so you all can follow along. But we've been out of practice for a sec, and our blocks are all really wordy and inefficient. So it's not going to help you to just take our work verbatim.
Not at all.
We're old and bad, kids. Just...
We are very bad.
Yeah, I mean, I think the rebuttals all show that. The last one.
All right.
Just like
thanks, y'all.
And then the 2AR.
Yeah,
I got muted.
That's how you know. Just like stop. Like 2NR, just forget about it. Don't even talk about it anymore.
All right.